teaching foundations of math and related areas. The main focus is on formal approaches to beginners. Rough sets is one of them. Use plenty of algebra, logic, and methodology in it. I also work in education research. I publish quite a bit in that too, and in gender studies too. I'm also a GNU art expert, and I have plenty of experience with it. And mm, I've also published in women in STEM, lesbian, and trans issues, and yeah, I'm also quite active in these areas. And I was still recently quite active in I was involved in free software activism. I was a leader of Ubuntu Women Project and was also a coordinator of Kolkata. And, okay, so that is roughly about me. And the structure of this talk will be mainly about concepts. I'll speak of basic concepts, then I'll speak about feminisms, then I'll go into more concepts, then I'll speak about different pointers, and then go into harassment policies. Then I'll go into diversity, examples, and then trans people in STEM, and what needs to be done. I think what needs to be done will be covered throughout the whole talk. So that's how it will be. Next next slide is this. Yeah. And the first thing which one has to note is this. It is very important to engage with issues from a sound theoretical basis and critically re-examine the language of oppressors and associated power dynamics. And feminist theories are absolutely essential for ensuring survival, proper quality of life, and productivity at all levels of organization. And related to all this, that means it's always better to use a more abstract approach. And I think it will be easier to apply from the abstract to the concrete. And first of all, one has to know about the abstract. Uh, I think everybody has some experience of the world, and so they will be knowing at least something. And one thing to be noted is that nobody in the world, nobody in history has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of the people oppressing them. And this is due to Shakur, who is a US civil rights activist, was granted political asylum in Cuba in 1979. And this is to be noted. Yeah, I'll start with the definition of sex. Yeah, scientifically, sex of a person is best seen as a tuple of parameters corresponding to hormonal, brain, clinical, chromosomal, physical sex, and much more. And the data relating to this cannot be properly classified in many senses. But if you allow for a more number of uh, categories, then we'll get better results. And one thing which is to be noted is that in feminist discourses, often people speak of biological sex. This is a really old notion and correctly corresponds to parts of the concept of sex. And that is very problematic. And it's better to use the scientific definition. And you should note that modern biology is in a state of flux. Many so-called important textbooks in endocrinology are outdated, and this in itself is suggestive of many older academics being dogmatic and insensitive. And Historically, of course, progress in biology has been slow and strongly hindered by religion and the patriarchy. Still, much of it is formulated from a binary cis perspective, and this matters. It has to be corrected. And we find it interesting to note that the fine structure of the clitoris was discovered as recently as 2005. There are related papers. It was found that it's much larger than it was thought to be. That says quite a bit of the kind of biology that has been done in history. We come to the definition of gender. Gender is a plural term that refers to gender identity, expression, and gender as a social construct. All three are different. It helps if one specifies what one is speaking about when one is talking about gender. And genders, of course, exist on a spectrum and do not abide by religious ideas of binary gender with its rigid descriptions of heteronormativity. In most contexts, yeah, this I've already mentioned. And gender identity of a person is the person's own sense of gender without regard to expression of the same in society. A large number of gender identities are known. Were known in multiple cultures before Christian imperialism. Some studies show that it is strongly influenced by hormonal exposure during prenatal development. There are studies that also relate gender identity to brain structure, hormones in brain, and other modern biological markers of sex. And in fact, gender identity may be said to be determined by unchangeable connections within the human brain subject to certain assumptions. And I'll continue with concepts. Cisgender refers to individuals who identify with the gender they were assigned to at birth. And gender diverse is an umbrella term. It's one of the best terms to describe non-cisgender people. And there are a number of references for all this. And then specifically, you can refer to Julia Serrano's writings and also the work of the Gender Identity Research Institute, the papers of Diamond, and a lot more. This infographic dates to 2005 or so, and there was some plagiarism issues associated, and the latter versions are not so good. Anyway, next I go to terminology. I guess you know most of this. Cisgender, transgender. I won't be defining all of them. Agender, bigender, gender fluid, non-binary, transsexual. The word transsexual meant something else before 2006. It had plenty of pathologization associated, and later it became much more acceptable. And in trans women, note that there's a gap between trans and women, that trans is used as an adjective and not as a category. And people with differences in sexual development, the same thing as intersex. And the gender diverse I've already mentioned, and queer theory, there are many, and there are many issues with them too. I won't go into all the details here. There are indigenous genders like Native Americans have as many as 5. Other cultures too have multiple genders. Indian genders too exist, and there are categories like Hijras, Tirunangais, Saravani. These are not exactly genders, they are more related to culture. And so they're like quite different. They're closer to they're not really very close to gender identity. And that matters. And of course, Facebook and In Facebook and Google, you'll find plenty of gender options. That is due to to changes in society. And then I go into the very concept of consent. So two or more people have consented to a mutual sexual act involving all of them if and only if they're all mature enough to consent, are under no coercion and have explicitly consented to the act at all instants of the act. This, of course, is a somewhat mathematical definition, and it's important to explain this to people. It's not easily understood, and it's, of course, important. And sexual acts that do not involve mutual consent amount to sexual violence or rape, irrespective of the relationship between the people involved. The above technical definition, of course, needs to be explained because oppressive and discriminative power structures have distorted society in a grotesque way. When I go to what feminisms are systems of political, economic, personal, and social perspectives and methods that critically seek just and optimal rights for women and gender diverse people in all spheres of life in theory and praxis. Praxis is practice. Some like to use equal rights instead of just and optimal, and that has its problems, and there are plenty of philosophy associated to all these definitions. And while one need not know every aspect of it, but it helps definitely. Though this is not so important for immediate application. And in any specific society, discrimination tends to have much variety, and varieties remain hidden to different extents relative to the population. A reasonable feminist approach should be able to identify discrimination and vectors, propose mechanisms of the same, propose solutions and strategies for handling the issues locally and globally over associated time frames. And next I'll deal with few feminist concepts. Yeah. In social sciences, it's important to select subsets of information dynamics from which all other complex phenomena may become explicable. An example is Das Kapital, which is the work of a genius. And there, of course, this is done in a very nice way. And there are different types of feminisms, and they have used different abstractions like intersectional, Marxist, lesbian, grounded, socialist. But whatever there is much in common between the different feminisms, there is also radical feminism, the so-called sex positive ones, then hierarchy based ones, then there's separatist, trans, lipstick, transnational, and queer, of course, eco, anthropocene, functional, and geek. The functional version is due to me, where I stress more on applied aspects. But of course, I am closer to Marxist, intersectional, and lesbian. It's my position. And yeah, next, second. Yeah, and Marxist feminism is quite important for a number of reasons because of the deep influence that it has had and still having on feminist approaches. Socialist feminism is actually older than Marx, and even Marx was aware of this. And Of course, class matters always in feminist praxis. And there's plenty of research that shows that capitalist structures depend on the patriarchy in an essential way. In India, for example, over 70% of women do unpaid housework. Often employment contracts are related to subordination of women through marriage contracts, and in general, capitalist structures and variants thereof oppress women in a number of different ways. Traditionally, family structures also help right-wing governments to reduce welfare, permit their cronies to employ lesser number of workers, and reduce the employment problem from exploding, because if women start wanting work, then things are going to become problematic. And the East Bloc is particularly important because they can be seen as a driving force behind feminist activism all over the world. For example, in Soviet Union, they had women's suffrage in 1970, legalization of abortion in 1920, criminalization of marital rape in 1922 itself, and of course they have had generous maternity leave, network of child care centers, etc. And of course, women were accorded equal rights right from the beginning of USSR. So, and and even same-sex marriage was virtually legalized in Russian SSR. Now that corresponds to about 1920 or so. The USSR came slightly later. So, and but same-sex relationships were criminalized. These male same-sex relationships were criminalized again in 1934 after long debates and democratic centralism. And this is suggestive of the lasting impact of religious dogma on substantial sections of the population, because this whole events mean that the people decided. And it's also true that often the position of women in USSR was celebrated and highlighted in Soviet publications. They also highlighted the absence of similar rights in the USA and the West. And interestingly, East Germany decriminalized homosexuality in late 1957. And a specific version of feminism is trans feminism. And this arose because of the long history of feminism concentrating on older binaries and related erasure. And and it's also a fact that many feminists, or most feminists, updated their views after the emergence of trans feminism in 2011 or so. And yeah, Julia Serrano, of course, has written a lot on various aspects of trans feminism, including the scapegoating of femininity in general and on trans experiences. She has helped to destroy or discard a number of dangerous, sexist, wrong positions held by key people, the general public. And yeah, you can find some of her works in her website, and of course, she has written a number of books. And interestingly, till the year 2000, the existence of trans lesbians was barely known. In subsequent large surveys, it was found that over 50% of trans women were lesbians. This can be explained by medical prejudice, pathologization, and limited discourse about trans people before 95 or so. When I come to Indian feminisms, yeah, Indian feminisms, of course, they had a slow start due to the stranglehold of the Brahminical and Dalit patriarchy, the patriarchy of a colonial mindset. So one can speak of different aspects of the patriarchy. And from about 1978 or so, women's issues began to be seriously discussed. And just after independence, too, there were a number of pro-women uh, acts and legislation passed, but it was hardly sufficient to handle things. And it's also a fact that, yeah, indigenous feminism did not really progress before 78 or so. And the Dalit movement also had very restricted focus. And of course, Indian genderism, everything is more Victorian and it has its own unique features. And the way feminism is practiced is there are a number of collectives, NGOs, academic subgroups with different focus and bias. And that's how feminism is done in India. And a few of these are substantially against gender diverse and LGBTQ people, which is quite surprising. Is It's not really surprising because they have their own. The people involved are much older and have stuck to older ideas of biological sex and things like that. And the relation between religion and feminism is to be noted well. Most, if not all, religions are strongly patriarchal. Typically, religions have been used by feudal or modern ruling classes to subjugate their subjects and enforce loyalty. So they just get modified for the purposes of war and wealth accumulation. Even Buddhism has been steeped in the patriarchy since its origin and never tried to go beyond that. During Buddha's time, women were regarded as impure and evil by religious people in the subcontinent. And even Buddha didn't try to improve things. That's a fact. And yeah, then I'll go faster because of the slides have too much material. Until, yeah, there's another interesting fact. Until 1959, when China cracked down on Tibetan aristocrats, the Dalai Lama, the largest serf owner, who fled to India around 90, at that time, around 98% of the population was enslaved in miserable serfdom. Physical torture and sexual abuse was also rampant in the monasteries then. And not surprisingly, recent Anthropocene studies do not see any integration between Buddhism and feminism. And it may be noted that yeah, China basically has a very secular approach rather than an atheist approach on the people. So, okay, then we go to the idea of patriarchy. Yeah, patriarchy can be seen as a socio-political and cultural system that values traditional masculinity over traditional femininity. Is this definition okay? Not too sure because what is traditional matters. And there are examples where the idea of traditional keeps changing, has changed over in history also. So one has to be careful with this kind of definition. And since oppression involves other parameters like race, class, caste, etc., many have tried to use terms like intersectionality and hierarchy. I won't go into all the details of this. And of course, patriarchy is directly associated with concepts of gender binaries, heterosexism, superiority of men over women, traditional sexist values, misogyny, objectification, heteronormativity, etc. And even if you consider atypical tribes, one can analyze them from this perspective. And they may not be that patriarchal in some respects, at least. The idea of agency is also important. It is in the slides, you can check them. Agency is simply the ability to identify goals and make related choice and act upon them. And in most situations, oppressed people may not have the agency to improve their own quality of life. So it's important to investigate whether some person or group of people have enough agency to be able to do anything. So you can ask questions like, does a 20-year-old woman educated up to class 5 have the agency to excel in higher mathematics? This can be an interesting question for investigation. And one can also speak of feminist agency in a number of contexts. Then I come to closeted LGBTQ people. So one needs to define what closeted is. So here is a definition which I have proposed. An LGBTQ person is closeted if and only if they cannot express themselves in relation to their desired appearance, identity-specific behaviors, association, action, and possibly advocacy due to societal pressure. And being closeted causes undue stress, affects relationships, it causes disengagement, a host of other symptoms, and severely affects quality of life. Some even internalize homophobia, lesbophobia, and transphobia as a result of being closeted. In fact, many homophobic and transphobic people are closeted homosexuals. A number of religious people fall under the category. And of course, you can find a number of examples even in popular media. And psychometric scales for internalized homophobia and lesbophobia have been developed over the last 4 to 5 decades. So these things have been under investigation for a long time. And then I go to the next concept, which is of objectification. So sexual objectification is perceiving or treating a person as an object. And there are a number of definitions of objectification. Some are quite long, and the even longer versions and the feminist literature. It helps to see them. But objectification is much easier to understand uh, from a practical perspective. If you see a situation, you might be able to reduce it faster. And because if you use this short definition in the beginning and directly reason about context, then you can better understand it. And this is a longer definition. I am skipping these slides. And many people have pointed it out. And you can see this thing. At a practical level, it's much easier, and you can see the website of everydayfeminism.com. There they have plenty of examples. And you can also read the article on empowered versus objectified there. And of course, it's easy to distinguish between sexual attraction and objectification. In most Hindi films, you find plenty of objectification that have been often passed off as sexual attraction. And that is quite ridiculous. And in the concept of microaggressions is very important in analyzing oppression, discrimination, and other things. They are small, often subconscious actions that marginalize people in oppressed groups. This is the most general definition. Originally, it was defined in the context of critical race theory. And so they are the brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative. You can replace racial slights and insults with sexist slights and insults, for example. And that's how it is used in feminist theory. And many microaggressions exist because of macroaggressions existing. And because the microaggressors do not understand the basic nature of the macroaggression and lack empathy. So it's about classes of microaggression and classes of macroaggression here. And there's an example here. Or somebody committing on somebody's stress is an example of a microaggression, especially if the comment is totally unwanted. And people using guys for addressing everybody is another example of a microaggression. This word, of course, relates to colonial ideas of male-dominated societies. It is part of male-only violent subcultures. It is not gender neutral. And of course, LGBTQ people experience a wider set of microaggressions. So you can, there are whole websites dedicated to microaggressions. And even I have one nice article in Feminist India, which is here. You can look at it. I'll be putting the slides in ResearchGate and other places so you can have a look. I'll be sharing the slides. So then the idea of imposter syndrome is important for LGBTQ people too. While women, of course, raised in conservative environment often display low levels of confidence, their capabilities due to severe negative conditioning. This can happen due to sexism, benevolent sexism, people telling them to lower their ambitions, acting surprised when they are good, etc. A related abstraction is that of imposter syndrome, the feeling that the perceived unknown shortcomings would be discovered. So one needs to internalize all this, internalize sexism and other things, and in that case one develops imposter syndrome. And this leads to all kinds of difficulties in work, study, and collaboration and in all other situations. It is also experienced by LGBTQ people who are closeted. Typically, they are likely to feel confused, stressed, and even despondent. And some of them even develop internalized homophobia or lesbophobia as a result. One has to be careful. The Nordic model is important for a number of reasons. It helps you to fix your position in relation to what is known as sex positivism, which has a number of problems associated. And the Nordic model, it's the approach to prostitution, also known as the sex buyer law, provides support. What it does is it decriminalizes all those who are prostituted. It provides services to help them exit and make buying people for sex a criminal offense, and in order to reduce the demand that drives sex trafficking. And the approach has been adopted by a number of countries, and it should be noted it is based on a number of field studies. And some of the findings are that sex work leads to alienation of women from their bodies and to feelings of worthlessness and disgust. This is similar to what victims of other sexual violence, such as incest, rape, and domestic violence, feel. Those who bought sex had no idea about the consequences of their action. Other capitalism-friendly sex-positive models ignore ground realities. So this is quite important and helpful in a number of LGBTQ-related discourses. And on the colonial dimension, I won't say too much, but I'll say a few things. India was, of course, created by the British colonialists from a number of distinct kingdoms. They imposed their Christian bigotry of sex, sexuality, and gender. And you can have a look at Victorian law to understand Indian law. They're very closely related. And most of what they imposed remains etched into modern Indian power hierarchies based on class, caste, religion, patriarchies, and subcastes. All these are extremely important to a number of people in India. And example of colonial rulers struggling with rampant homosexuality in India can be found in this article. It's a research article of a historical nature. It says a lot. And it is also that the patriarchies in the colonies became more anti-LGBTQ than before as a result. This point should be noted. And then I come to LGBTQ laws in India. Of course, consensual homosexual relations are officially legal since 2018 in India, but the lack of inclusive sex education, uh, in particular, has reduced its impact. Most of Indian law has been, of course, the result of lazy plagiarism from colonial era laws. And also, of course, was a landmark judgment. And then came the transgender law with all its shortcomings. That's more recent. It has its positive aspects too. For it makes the state to define gender rather than individuals cannot define their gender by themselves according to that law. That is one major problem. It does not recognize the large diversity among gender diverse people, does not distinguish between specific cultures and gender, requires medical certificates, and there's no idea of families of trans people. It suggests a number of welfare schemes and other things, true, but the implementation aspects are yet to be done. And it should be noted that it does not treat trans people at par with cis people. So that is it. Trans people do not get enough rights relating to marriage, sexuality, etc. In fact, some of them are in contradiction with the law. And you can note some more facts, which is that women and LGBTQ people are underrepresented in STEM disciplines. They are underrepresented in specific STEM disciplines. In mathematics, it's slightly better. In other subjects, it's not that good. And of course, there are variations. I won't go into all this data here because there are not enough studies on LGBTQ people. There are plenty of studies on women, but not on LGBTQ people. And this is quite problematic. There are few new groups which have been formed, but detailed studies are not known. So the Global Gender Gap project does not address much of the things relating to LGBTQ. So I am skipping the slides here. You can always look into the slides to see what has been said. And math anxiety is another aspect. Yeah, there's quite a lot of work on gender and math anxiety. Uh, the definition of math anxiety is this: it's a negative reaction to math or to mathematical situations. Can be seen as a feeling that interferes with the mathematical problem solving abilities of an individual in real life situations. So this can affect even people in social sciences and elsewhere. That matters. And it is again related to a number of microaggressions and macroaggressions. And yeah, there has been a lot of work on that, but uh, yeah, I won't go into more details, and this is well known. This is about gender discrimination. That is what this cartoon says. You can read it. Right? Uh, yeah, it is. It's also sexist, and you should know the difference between sexist and gender discrimination. There is a more general term that is also that is more directed at women. Sexism is always about gender discrimination of against women of women, so it includes trans women too. Yeah, and next I come to sexual harassment. Here definitions of course matter. It's unwelcome sexual uh, conduct which makes a person feel offended, humiliated, and or intimidated, and it can be a one-off incident. A number of examples here, like it can be about unwelcome touching, hugging, may also be about sexual violence, rape, and inappropriate advances in social networking sites, even unwanted invitations, go out on dates. All this fall under sexual harassment. So that's the definition, and policies, yeah, and policies matter a lot. And education and open communication about harassment policies adopted and complaint handling process is absolutely essential. But often what happens is that complaint committees are a boys club, and ideally investigation should involve external teams. That does not happen often. And then what can be said is, yeah, what should be said is, yeah, policies should involve the organization in question, should be customized for the organization. That is also not done. And in India, poor policy formulation and implementation are far too common. One notes, like for example, there was the Satyajit Ray Institute case, in which the problems were at almost every level. And of course, it should be noted that Indian judiciary is still in the dark ages. It is yet to learn, define sexual assault properly. Only certain kinds of sexual assaults are sexual assaults, and there's no concept, and it's said to understand marital rape. Understand that marital rape is rape even now. So, and given this, things, yeah. And next, I go to a specific policy. It is suggestive of the policy adopted at a number of institutes. What they do is they simply copy the national sexual harassment policy that has been put out by the ministry. It was put out in 2013. It's very outdated. It only refers to women. So automatically all those who legally fall under women will fall under that. But in adopting such a policy, no sensitization of stakeholders has been done. And it's a fact that in ISI, some are stuck with Badalok patriarchal views. That's a problem. And diversity officers do not exist in the institute. And no specific support system for gender diverse and LGBTQ people exists in the institute. So this is the situation in ISI, but some other institutes like ISA have slightly better policies, and they have even implemented a few things, but a lot needs to be done. JNU had a relatively better GS cache, but that got replaced by an ineffective ICC. So, and what academia should do is they need to reformulate their harassment policies to go well beyond recommendations of the Trans Act in a progressive way. They have to adopt their own policies rather than copying the policy of the ministry, which is a very old policy and it does not cover too many things. It does not even define sexual assault properly. It is necessary to include all kinds of sexualities in the policy and elsewhere. And diversity should be taken more seriously, obviously. Yeah, and it is for academia to pave the way for inclusion and not sit ages behind the Indian law in particular. And here are some gender diversity friendly actions. Here are some recommendations of, uh, of relatively friendly actions, which is that preferred pronouns in all relevant forms with scope for handling closeted people should be there. So in all forms, there should be columns for preferred pronouns and elaborations for closeted people too. And gender neutral washrooms and hostels for those who need them. This is helpful especially for non-binary people. And explicit non-discrimination policy, which is often missing. Scope for handling closeted people. Regular sensitization programs for all stakeholders. This is very important. And updated and inclusive gender and sexual harassment policy. And reasons for diversity are well known. There are plenty actually. And diversity is important for quality of research. Generally, humans have limited capability. And if you have more diversity, the quality of research automatically improves. In India, of course, we don't really have much diversity in academia. It is restricted by caste, even by class, and things are not that good. And of course, there are funding issues and other things too. Productivity, of course, depends on diversity, and uh, and if you have more gender diversity, of course, that will help. And cultural diversity is also important because cultural diversity is related to understanding of science and the discipline itself. Therefore, for example, there are too many ways of doing mathematics, and mathematics is and also depend the different cultures do mathematics differently. You can have a look at say Chinese mathematics, for example, and many things get forgotten because of lack of diversity. Next, in second, yeah. Next, I'll go to yeah. Diversity makes people perform better, and it also helps in critically reviewing work, and thus it becomes more adaptable. And there are a number of examples for all this. And there are many examples in evolutionary biology and other subjects. So you can see the slides. I'm skipping them. For example, homosexuality in animals was noted long ago, but was recognized much later. This is due to the lack of diversity in scientific teams. That is mentioned in detail in the slides. I'm skipping them. And to actually implement, to have good diversity in any organization, it's important to have dedicated teams for that. At least one diversity officer is necessary. Of course, there is no one form.
Okay, thanks to Dr. Mani for the nice video, for the nice lecture. Um, let's go to the chat box and maybe Okay. Yeah, Tibro?
Thank you, yes, thank you, Professor Mani, for the. So it is. I actually completely agree with you on the very first part that we absolutely need to learn feminist theory to understand our.
Tibro, you're not audible now. We lost you. I can't hear you. Can other people hear him?
No, I can't either.
Okay, okay. I thought there was some problem in my audio.
Tibro, you might be muted.
Okay, are there questions while Tibro tries to reconnect? Okay, if there are not, I sort of have a question to Dr. Mani. So you mentioned talking about microaggressions. I wanted to sort of um, ask the question in a little different direction, in the sense that uh, do these continuous microaggressions, are there specific examples where they lead to bigger institutionalized problems?
Yeah, they built a culture actually. They are building blocks of a culture. You can always see it that way. So they are really important.
But
A culture of hate, for example, can be generated through a number of microaggressions, for example. They sustain hate and things like that. So they are always important. That's how the theory is done. That's how it's applied also. And so people try to concentrate on such things so that there be great more, so that broader acceptability can really happen. That is one aspect.
also, if someone who is external to an exchange, where someone is displaying microaggression, um, mostly I think we can just be a little vigilant and we would notice something like that. But are there instances where uh, some specific kinds of clues will help?
Clues for what? For
for for
understanding
for,
the
for noticing someone is being a little hostile towards another person, especially if they are minorities in STEM or in any field, or an LGBTQ person, for example.
so yeah, if you notice such things, then should be pointed out correctly. That helps in many cases
Mhm.
because they might have just learned it by copying it from somebody else.
Of course, the
Or
culture that
that,
you mentioned.
yeah.
Yeah. Prashant, would you like to ask your question? I think you had a question. You're muted for some time. Can you hear us, Prashant? Okay. Um, Dr. Prajwal has a question. Ma'am, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Mani. So I had a sort of little bit of a nitty-gritty question. So you mentioned preferred pronouns as an alternative to asking for gender. Now, this question is very common. People require it in conferences and registration and things like that. And I have heard arguments that it should not be a preset set of options. It should be a self-description thing. The counter argument to that is that we do want to monitor what is the status of inequity, and one of the measures is representation, whether it be in conferences or schools or departments and so on. So, and then I've heard this argument that preferred pronouns may be a better way to ask for this rather than just gender boxes. So is there a standard set of recommended, I won't say standard, but is there a recommended set of pronoun options that one could use, which, when a department asks you, okay, so what do you want us to do? Then, you can say, okay, for example, in your conference registration, use this set of options for preferred pronoun rather than asking for gender. Is there a recommended
No,
set?
I never said that it should be asked instead of gender. One can
I
ask
see.
both.
Okay.
And preferred pronouns, of course, it's not hard to write down, to list out the choices. I don't see much of difficulty in that. People don't have too many preferred pronouns really. And in case it goes beyond what is listed, they can always write it. So that option can always be there. And even Facebook and Google, they follow a similar policy. When it comes to gender, they allow a long list of genders, and then it is possible to write one's gender also. So that part is not too difficult in my opinion. But the thing is, for closeted people, how should preferred pronouns be handled? That becomes more difficult. So
Right.
that's what.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the preferred pronoun thing helps, right? Because one could, whether one is closeted or not, one could have they as the preferred pronoun and it not become sort of foregrounded in a sense. Maybe.
Abha had a question. Let me just read it out. Um, so, so the question was, in academic institutions, what are some aspects that students as well as professors and admin need to be vigilant towards in order to make it a safe space for those who identify as LGBTQ+.
Yeah, I think I answered it in the chat box.
Oh, I'm sorry. I might have missed that. Oh yeah, you did. I'm sorry for that.
I think I
Yeah.
answered all questions in the chat box.
Okay. So Abby has raised her hand. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah. Hello. Hi, Mani. It's nice hearing you talk, as always. Like like I'm really concerned about like disclosing any nature like in any thing that can be identified just to identify a person gender, gender identity or sexual orientation, because until like we come to a like place where like see, honestly, I don't trust most institutions in this country with my with the with a lot of with that information, I don't like, for instance, like I don't trust my current institution with that information for a very particular reason. I'm just concerned that like if like of like how we would like address the lack of privacy within data privacy within academic institutions, like uh, for instance, like if the let's say assume that like the person in the admissions office is like a homophobe or a transphobe,
Hmm. Yeah.
like yeah. I hope I wasn't too vague.
Yeah, there should be policies for handling such people too. Like for example, there is this SC/ST Protection Act, and we need policies like that. More, we need well-defined policies plus sensitization. All that is really essential. Otherwise, there is certainly going to be problems. So that's why many people are still not coming out. And that is how things are. We really need to work on various aspects.
And you can go ahead and ask your question, Dr. Prajwal.
Yeah, so I was wondering, do you have any examples of where institutions such as your own, Indian sort of DST, DAE funded institutions, for example, have trained training and sensitization education programs for their faculty and administrative staff to respect and to deal respectfully with a gender diverse workforce, student force, etc. Do you know any examples?
Yeah, in ISA they have done certain things. That's what I've heard in ISA.
ISER
But
Kolkata, you say?
ISA Pune definitely, and in Kolkata they even introduced a gender neutral bathroom, it seems. And but ISA hasn't done anything much. The
So your own
statutory.
institute?
No, I think I've discussed that in the slides. So it's there in the talk. I did speak about different institutions, and many institutions just copy the ministry policies, and they don't do anything much. There's no sensitization. Even the harassment policies are not taught. So it's quite vague also. So that is there. And Prashant has an interesting question. Are there attempts along the lines of Leelavati's daughter to document the biography of scientists who belong to the LGBTQ community? And I think the Life of Sciences has done some work along these lines, but more needs to be done. So,
Hi, am I audible now?
yeah. Any other question?
Tibro, we can hear you, but it's very faint. Is there any chance you can?
Can you hear me now?
Very nice.
Yeah.
Now it's fine.
Okay, great. So yeah. Okay, I have quite a few comments and questions. So I was wondering if I could recount some of my experiences in ISC, especially you just mentioned ISC has not done much. It has not done anything. So I mean, and I'm speaking as of now. I'm not in ISC anymore, but I have friends and I regularly visit them and I stay in touch. It's a horror. It's sheer horror. But also thank you for beginning the talk and spending a considerable amount of time on feminist theory, because at least in my own experience, learning feminist theory is one of the things that helped me understand my queerness, my own gender identity, and also how to survive with my queerness and my gender identity. And so I believe it is absolutely essential for people in STEM, and especially for people like us, for queer people, we to even understand our position, to even understand the oppression that we face. I think it is very important for us to read feminist theory and engage with it. So thank you so much for that. Before I go on to the direct, okay, maybe I should start with the experiences. So we have so there is, you have already mentioned this many times, that there is no specific body aimed at redressal of queer people's harassment because of their queerness, because of their gender identity or their sexual identity. Also, I would just like to add that even the sexual harassment cell that is there in ISC is very ineffectual. And what are the kind of legal recourses that queer people should take, or queer peer support groups should have in place to ensure our safety, to ensure that we get some justice when we are harassed? And I say this because even so, although women's sexual harassment, like cis women sexual harassment by cis men, that has been talked about for a long time, even it has even been talked about in patriarchal settings, even when women have been treated as properties. I believe prior to 1980, rape was considered a crime, but the complainant was the woman's husband or father. So even in a patriarchal setting, there is a notion of sexual harassment. Uh, and definitely that has improved a lot now, but still there is no redressal for sexual harassment complaints even by cis women. And there are people in the sexual harassment cell, in fact there are women, cis women, upper caste cis women in the sexual harassment cell who have been known to protect rapist professors. And in such a situation, what do you suggest queer and women's organization, like peer support groups and organizations, how should they organize, how should they prepare? And so not just sexual harassment, I also have seen fellow queer students being harassed, gaslighted, and blackmailed. And at least the blackmailing was a criminal, like is a clear criminal offense. And no, so the institute essentially ensured that no criminal action was initiated, because apparently that would tarnish the name and reputation of the institute. And I myself was a first year student back then, and I didn't know better to how to organize or how to reach out to people. And the person who was persecuted, the person who was blackmailed, neither did they know better. But I'm asking now, so what I usually do is, so I have certain friends who are lawyers, and I never shy away from making a police complaint. But this is on a personal scale. How do we deal with this as peer support groups? How do we teach our queer, how do we like inculcate more confidence in our queer peers? And how, I mean, I have never felt safe in my 5 years at ISC, and my fallback plan was that I'm physically strong, so if I'm physically accosted, I can fight back. That's not a safe way to go about things.
Yeah, obviously.
So how now, and this is not something I can tell my queer peers, so how as queer peer support groups should we function?
Yeah, the whole policy has to be revamped. The harassment policies are often done in a very narrow perspective. That is one problem.
Yeah.
Then, and even sexual assault is not properly defined in law. That's another problem. So all these things need to be looked into. So one has to do a lot more sensitization and also policy development. And these things I did mention in other places.
Yes, also it was there in your talk. I guess I'm speaking from a place of utter helplessness, because like I have engaged with my queers, with my peers, queer or otherwise, to talk to everybody about like the queer identity, and how, like what not to say and how not to behave, and what are questions which should not be suddenly sprung upon a person, how not to out a person to their families, and how to, if a person is not out to their families, or if they're not even out to their friends but they're out only to a select group of close friends, how do you behave with that person? But there is, I have felt so helpless when it has come to policy, because no amount, so it has always been on an individual level, and people who masquerade as progressive, in at least in ISC, they have always policed me and censored me when I've tried to bring up queer issues in any progressive space. So say there is a student council election happening and there is a progressive front, and they call me up because I am a known progressive person, and they say we should talk about queer issues openly, and it should be on our agenda, and they shut it down. They're like, no, that would be too much, we won't get votes, and don't you think we should, this is not the right place to bring this up? And then what is the right place to bring up my dignity? And you have been talking about microaggressions, and I think Aditya struck up a conversation about that. One of the, I have one of the major microaggressions, like that I have felt, is this policing. Like people would acknowledge that yes, your concern is valid, but don't you think you should not be so vocal about it? And my concern is not just valid, it is crucial for my dignity. It is crucial for me
Actually,
to,
much more than a microaggression.
yes, yes,
It's much
yes, yeah, indeed it is, indeed it is. It is basically a systemic, like it is a,
like
it is the
silencing.
huh.
It's the silencing technique being used.
Yes, yes. And it is being used dually. Once, so there are the right-wing people and the authorities doing it, and the progressive peers are also upholding the same Brahminical patriarchal norms and policing me. It's happening dually. So I guess this part I just wanted to let it off my chest, because
And yeah, one has to be more vocal. One should write in different forums, make people more sensitive, and I think eventually it will help.
yes,
And
yes,
all this did,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
all
please.
this took a lot of time to happen too. So,
Yes, it does. It does. It has, and in fact, yeah. So also, like with the current government and the pushback of progressive policies across institutions, and like putting more right-wing leaning people in power in administration in institutions, that has made life veritably hell for queer people and for women. I am not going to elaborate more on that, but I should probably let everybody know that okay, I don't think it's my place to talk about it, but it is happening. It is happening across institutions.
yeah,
Um,
these are,
we are. You
yeah.
talked about Dalit patriarchy. I would love to talk a little bit about that, because
Yeah, even Dalit people are not fully aware, they're not sufficiently sensitized. Those issues are always there.
yes, so what I was more, so I was so trying to refer to is, so I am from West Bengal, and so a huge Dalit movement in West Bengal, even pre-independence, was actually a religious movement during the Bhakti movement. And even prior to Bhakti movement, or literatures during the Bhakti movement, you will find a lot of gender non-conforming, uh, I guess, allusions to sex. And uh, even after Bhakti movement, these sexual practices continued among the Dalits, and it was called Deho Tattva, if I am not mistaken. And this is still documented in the Baul practices. So, but this same Dalit community now, the Namashudra community now, they're fairly Brahminical and they're fairly patriarchal. So, I'm just, so it is more of a historical point. So is it not so that Dalits have been trying to perform Brahmanism to make themselves more acceptable in the Brahminical political arena, and that is what is the origin of the Dalit patriarchy?
It is
Because
also due,
Yes.
It is also due to colonial policies.
Yes. That as well. And the colonials. Yes. Like, I mean, a lot of our anti-LGBTQ laws are indeed British laws. So yes. And I ask this because in that case, addressing LGBTQIA issues in the Dalit community could be also done through like bringing up their original, like the original Dalit practices and their culture again, and putting that in contrast with Brahmanism, and making it clear to them that they have had more gender non-conforming and more queer practices in the past, which were policed by Brahmins, and their patriarchal practices is essentially just them performing Brahmanism. It is. Yeah, yes.
One second.
Yes. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Dr. Shastri, maybe you could ask your question after Hebrew. You could just unmute, okay?
Now or
No,
after?
after Dr. Mani comes back.
Yeah, sure.
I'm so sorry, I'm taking up a lot of time.
No, that's fine. I think.
No, it's also
Mine was
amazing.
anyway a response to something you said. So
Oh, okay. No, it's also amazing to see like senior members, senior academic people attending this, because then
Yeah,
we feel hopeful. Sorry. So yeah, you were speaking about Dalit patriarchy.
Okay, yeah. That's fine.
So no, I
And
was sorry.
yes, yeah, one can of course remind them about the history and all, but that won't really be sufficient. It has to be cast in modern perspective, and then only then will it really help. Otherwise, can be quite difficult. If one just points out particular religious practices, for example, that won't be so helpful.
I am asking because I am not a Dalit. If you could share some resources, it would be amazing. I'm asking because I'm not Dalit, I'm upper caste, and I have Dalit friends who are progressive and who are like active in politics, and they're queer accepting, but not queer affirmative. So they know I am queer, and they're like, "Ha, bhai, kya hai?" And I'm like, not bhai, I'm not bhai. But basically, they acknowledge me as a friend and comrade. But so I want to talk with them about and bring this up. And I was basically asking you for pointers about how to do this, because I mean, being an upper caste person, I have to
Yeah,
tread carefully.
I think resources for this should be built up. Already certain, for example, feminism in India website.
Yes.
They've done quite some work, but there are other websites too, other groups who are working on this to some extent, at least. And there should be more effort. And,
Yes.
And things have to be communicated in multiple languages. When it comes to
Yes.
feminism, it's in regional languages. The developments are limited. Though, for example, in Tamil Nadu, for example, they've done quite a lot of work. And it's also connected with even with the Dalit movement there, for example, the Dravidian movement. So, but things
That's amazing.
there are many areas of improvement.
Also, I mean, one of my friends is from Tamil Nadu. They work with VCK, and they told me as well that they're doing a lot of work in inculcating feminist practices in the Dalit movement. Thank you and congratulations. It's amazing to know this, and it's amazing to hear this. Yes.
And Prajwal has a question.
it was more of a comment in response to something that Tibro said a little earlier about how even what he thought of as progressive groups were not safe for him. I mean, I just wanted to respond saying I don't think we have any option except to sort of initiate a shift. I mean, I don't know who can initiate it, but at least people who are aware do need to initiate the shift within scientific institutions. One, to have a shift where this kind of debate and dialogue is seen as a positive aspect of institutional life within science, because generally the tendency is to, in India especially, is to say that, you know, you're here to do your science, so, you know, it's here, your students are here to study and they shouldn't do other things. And as a result, you know, we are compelled to live our politics outside. But you know, uh, politics means, to be political means to think about what ought to be. I think it's just as simple as that, and it's incumbent on all of us to think about what ought to be, whether it is our science institution or our laboratory or our hostel or the country or whatever. So that is one aspect. So this kind of dialogue. So I would say Sthai is a sort of very nice, positive example. A similar study circle kind of thing in an institution where I was for many, many years was actually shut down. And that is not a good thing. And I'm hearing that current newer institutions are also shutting these things down by making students sign undertakings and so on. So I don't think that's a good trend, and we do need to push back on that. So that is one thing. And the second thing is, I don't think we have an option except to shift our, how shall I say, perspective on how we project our institutions. So we need to project our institutions as ones where everyone is welcome and everyone can thrive. And so if institutions aspire to do that, they are going to reap benefits. So once they, I mean, that there's just a small shift, I think, that is required. So tomorrow, for example, if somebody asks me, a young person asks me, you know, can you give me some recommendations about which institutions I should apply to? What Tibro said is going to be at the back of my mind, and I'm going to say, you know, that institution may be good for X, Y, and Z, but it may not be good for such and such. And mind you, this would be regardless of whether that person considers themselves as gender normative or diverse or whatever, because I think that if an institution is not felt as safe for a queer person, it is not a good climate, period. It's not a good climate for anybody. So I would not, you know, recommend such an institution for that reason. I would say this is a negative of this institution. So if institutions can make this shift and try to project themselves, you know, differently, not just by how many nature papers their professors publish, but also by what is the kind of climate that they have in their institutions. Will all people be welcome, and can all people thrive? At least, is it an institution that aspires to be like that? You know, no institution is perfect, but at least explicitly, overtly, in their advertisements on their webpage, do they aspire to be that? And I think we just need to make that shift. I don't think we have any other option.
Yes, they, them. I mean, my preferred pronouns are they, them, not he. I'm sorry. I should have.
Sorry.
I should put that in my name, but I have not. I'm sorry. Also, I have, so like you said, we should practice politics inside our institutions. I've been doing that for 5 years, and then being pushed back. And one of the things that hurt me most is that, like, people who practice with us, like the progressive people, they also police us, and that is very much determined usually by their position of privilege. Like, are these cis people, are they upper caste people, are they men, are they cis het men? And they police more, because although they would probably like a little more liberal atmosphere in the institute, because that would be maybe more conducive to their living standards, they don't care enough about how hostile the environment is to queers, and they're okay with making compromises there. So I think it is absolutely important for queer people not to give in to this kind of policing, and for young people, like people who are in their first year of bachelor's, say, or who are hi Abby, it's amazing to see you again. Yes. So, for people who are, say, in the first year of their bachelor's or in their first year in any institute, it, I mean, it becomes more difficult, but this is something we should not compromise on. So, I mean, we should not compromise on our dignity to stay at a certain institute. And this would be possible only when there are enough institutes working at a good academic level who are also openly queer affirmative, not just queer accepting, but openly queer affirmative, like who have very stern and very effective policies against gender discrimination and harassment, as well as have regular sensitization programs. And like you mentioned, it is very important to have peer study circles, and that was where I have learned feminism and everything. And they are being pushed back across institutions, and we need to resist as soon as possible. And honestly, I don't know how.
I have a comment on what Prajwal said, if I may.
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Like the thing is that in my institute, like it tries really well to like masquerade as a queer affirmative place. I remember when like the 377 verdict happened. There was this 2-day lecture series that was organized by one of the departments, and like and one of there's an openly lesbian trans woman who is a visiting faculty in the institution, and it's still like we've had like faculty doing horrible things like advocating things like conversion therapy inside classrooms. I would say that is not. I wouldn't consider that like a microaggression. That is like an active call for violence. That is the scope of the micro thing is like gone. Yeah, it's a direct like you should not exist, straight to your face. I'm just saying that like I think also we need to be cautious as well, like in like observant of like which institutions are doing this merely for optics. And like just one of the things that my institution does is like make people sign those like things that Prajwal said. Like Prajwal said, like we're not allowed to organize among ourselves. We're not supposed to like bring inside things out to the outside public, and yep. It's I think it's like really important to like look at the gray areas that exist within our institutions. Like this just does not like limit itself to like while in second square people, there was professors who have said that things in the student improvement programs, there were people who said things like uh, like uh, 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 which are in direct opposition to basic autonomies of women, basic sexual autonomy of women, and I'm just saying that um the yeah, I hope I made sense.
Dr. Mani, your comments on that? On the gray areas in the institutes, and instead just, just posing to be progressive when they're actually not.
Yeah, that is there. Many institutions are just pretending and not doing anything much really. So that problem is always is there. It has started only now. That is also true. Previously, even this much was not there. So at least now we see that some people are trying to pretend. I think it will take some time for things to improve, but we should be active. That's really proactive, and that's really important.
Yes. So you mentioned that you have another meeting at 6 p.m. So
Yeah,
I think Dr. Prajwal has another comment, and you can.
Just a very brief comment responding to Abhi and to Mani, that I don't at all fault the argument that what some institutions do is just window dressing, like what you are describing your own institution. But I think there is a reason to sort of still have hope, because the fact that they've done it at all, as opposed to a lot of other institutions which do none of it, that is, I think, a step ahead. The what you might see as hypocrisy, or they just say and don't do and all of that, just I think reflects the diversity within the decision making body, where some people want to do good things and other people want to push back, and then some mishmash sort of finally gets done. And but I think it is a signature of some churning, at least. And we have to push further. I'm not saying that that is reason to be complacent, but I think it is at least a small step in the right direction, as opposed to many institutes which do nothing at all. So I think it is a signature that there are at least some people in the decision making bodies who want to move in the right direction. That's just what I want to say.
Also, in the spirit of, so at one point of time, we used to have these lists of, so we started having these lists of sexual harassers and gender harassers, which was just to be circulated among women and queer people, so that the stakeholders, the people who are at the most risk, most vulnerable to be harassed, they would know to avoid those people. I think queer people should also have similar lists of institutions, among at least among circulated among themselves, to know where they can be safe and where they cannot be. I mean, until and unless we have safety, even if people are masquerading as safety, it is absolutely important for queer people to know that it is masquerading and it's not safety, because the stakes are very high. And yeah.
One way to do this, which I know, is to have it as an escrow list. So there are 2-3 people who most people trust, and they maintain a list. So anybody can send them names, and then when they see that a person keeps recurring from multiple sides, then they take some action. They start to take some action.
Yes,
so that's
yes,
one
yes,
way
yes.
of doing it.
Yes, yes. Similarly for institutes, in fact. Similarly for institutes, like building up movements. And also it is, I think, and Professor Mani has definitely also, please, I guess, Professor Mani, we should probably thank you and let you go to your next meeting. And maybe we can still continue discussing if other people are available, because we don't want to keep you from your next
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
Thanks for the nice meeting, and and for the conversations too. The very interesting conversations. So we will meet some later. Of course, there are thousands of meetings going.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, sure.
it was amazing to have you. It was really amazing to have you. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
coming. Thank
thanks
you
for
so much.
inviting.
Do you have any final comment that you would like to leave us with, Dr. Mani?
Thanks for everything. It was a nice meeting you all,
Thank you.
and hopefully things improve. So
Sure.
I'll end on that comment.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Mani.
Thanks.
So with that, I'll stop recording and we'll formally end the session here. Thank you so much, Dr. Mani, for being with us.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks. Thanks for